Law stories. I've got Mr. Tom Farrar. Tom is been in law for over 50 years. We've got some amazing stories of one of the most unique ways of getting a speeding ticket to some epic foreign countries, including Nicaragua, Jamaica. We've got a 600,000 pounds of beef, and also of coming against the Ford Motor Company in the enhanced injuries trial, one of the first ones in the country. All of the law stories. It's a great one. Of course, it's brought to you by videocasestory.com. One of the best ways to grow your law practice and to get more referrals is through video case stories. Go to videocasestory.com/bigfish to learn 13 ways to get more referrals. All right, let's get started. About all the stories of the Nicaraguan government and etc. Let's talk a little bit. Doing this for about 5 or 6 years.
Well, times 10, yeah. I was admitted to practice here in Florida in June of 1969, so it's a bit more than 5 or 10.
That's amazing. I mean, I can't imagine the things you've seen. And you're in Pensacola right now, correct?
No, I'm in Miami.
You changed a bit over that time, huh?
Just a hair, yeah. It went from, I think when I was born, there were less than a million. I think it was less than a quarter of a million. And when in 1960 it was almost a million, and now it's about 3.5, something like that. So a few changes. And it went from a southern city, like not dissimilar to Jacksonville or Birmingham or Tampa, to a 75% Latin city. So there's been enormous changes in that regard as well.
I was just down there, and there's so many places that no one speaks English in Miami. There, it's a great. And so started as an attorney in the Army, correct?
Well, I actually started as a law clerk for Judge David Dyer of the old Fifth Circuit, and later of the 11th Circuit, because when it split up. Well, I started then, and then I did 2 years of active duty in the Army, yes.
And you some crazy stories there. I was noticed that you one of my favorite ones. We've got a lot of them here, but was this a speeding wife?
Yeah, that was a touchy client relationship there. Yeah, she was caught speeding on post, and she's a civilian, of course, or was a civilian, still is, and she. I knew it was going to be a $50 fine. She was clocked at 30 miles an hour in a 15 zone, and I didn't feel like paying $50, so I refused trial by the then commissioner, now magistrate, and demanded trial in U.S. District Court. I figured, no way they're going to try that. Well, I was wrong. They did. I think it was my last or next to the last day of the office. It was my last days. I remember I left the courthouse and cleared out my desk to leave, and but they tried it, and it was interesting because of course, Judge Alexander Lawrence, he was the judge in that district judge in that area, came into court and looked it down and says, "Speeding? Am I trying a speeding ticket?" He obviously a bit different from his normal caseload. And I said, "Oh yeah, this is an important case." And so, I guess they figured others would try the same thing if they knew to do it. Anyway, because she was what she was tried on was called the Assimilative Crimes Act, which basically says that a violation of state law on a federal reservation or federal territory is a violation of federal law. So they had to prove that she violated state law. And my principal argument was that the 15-mile-an-hour zone did not apply to her, that the state statute would apply, and the state statute was 30 miles an hour in a residential zone, 60 miles an hour in a non-residential zone. And she was charged with doing 30 miles an hour. She was charged with doing the speed limit. The regulation that reduced the speed limit to 15 miles an hour in that particular road or area was a regulation promulgated by the post commander. and military commander has no criminal jurisdiction, or has a regulation of a military commander has no effect on civilians during times of peace, which we certainly, in the United States at least, we still were at times of peace. We were engaged in the Vietnam War at the time, but that didn't apply here. So anyway, I just said, that it has no force and effect as to her. It was 30 miles an hour. That's what she's charged with. In fact, I brought out maps of posts to show that probably this area didn't even meet the definition of a residential area, and the real speed limit was 60. The trial went on for about 2 hours. The U.S. attorney obviously hadn't realized I don't think he understood what he was trying on, other than it was a speeding ticket, and he was waltzed in and put on the radar record. I got the radar record excluded. There was all sorts of state statutes limiting radar because of some speed traps that had been going on in Georgia for a number of years. This was being tried in Savannah, Georgia. I was at Hunter Army Airfield. Anyway, it wound up, ultimately, she was found not guilty. She was actually found guilty. We filed a notice of appeal, and the next day we got a notice vacating the order, finding her guilty and finding her not guilty. So I don't know what the story was there. That's the first time that's ever happened. That's never happened again. Filing a notice of appeal and winning. Anyway, that was my story. And of course, when my wife looked down at the start of the trial and saw the information that was placed in front of her, United States of America versus Maida B. Farrar, she just went berserk. The entire United States was against her. Anyway, that was my story. Again, I hadn't thought about that one for probably 50 years. It was fun to recall it.
That's fantastic. That's probably a way of getting out of a speeding ticket I've ever heard. So then early on represented the Nicaraguan government, correct?
Yeah, I've represented 6 foreign countries over my career. The first one I represented, actually the second one I represented was Nicaragua. I represented Panama before that. But yeah, when the Sandinistas took over and kicked Somoza out, and he fled, Bill Rogers from Arnold Porter called down, and I was hired. I was actually being paid by Omar Torrijos of Panama, the president of Panama at the time, because they didn't have any money. The treasury was empty when the Sandinistas took over, and so I did represent them for a period of a couple of years, and then their policies were a little different than mine, and I did wind up withdrawing as their counsel.
Represent the American Beef and Seafood Trading Association or trading company?
No, that was the defendant in one of the lawsuits that we handled. It was cabs trading was it for short. It was a Somoza company that had taken in the waning days of his regime had transported 800,000 pounds of beef. Nicaragua is a beef producing country. Into El Salvador and then into the United States, and it was in a cold warehouse here in Miami. So on behalf of the government, I sued. On behalf of a representative of the government, I sued to get the beef back, and it was in front of Judge William Hoovler. It was one of the great judges here in South Florida. And we succeeded at least in getting a preliminary injunction, and that was appealed to the then still the old Fifth Circuit. And John R. Brown wrote the decision and upheld the temporary injunction, which and Bill Rogers was surprised. He said he informed me that that's probably the only time a United States court has ever upheld a foreign expropriation decree. That was fun. That was one of my fun cases over the years.
That's amazing, and that's a lot of beef. Their storage, because there's a time element to that, isn't there?
It was frozen and it was in cold storage, both. It was It did have a limited time frame, but which is why we tried to use the preliminary injunction. After the preliminary injunction was successful, we wound up settling it and getting the beef sold and resolving the who got what.
And then, I mean, you've worked in extraditions as well, representing foreign governments.
No, you're thinking of when I was representing the government of Jamaica. Which is a phenomenal client. I loved Jamaica. They have, just as an aside, most people don't realize it, but they have the highest literacy rate in the Americas, including United States, Canada, or anybody else. The wonderful people, really smart. It was one of my favorite clients of all time was representing the government of Jamaica. But anyway, there was they were having crime problems in the Kingston area. There major there were gangs, one of which the major one was called the Posse, run by a guy named Jim Brown, and they had arrested him and tried him and convicted him, and they had appealed the sentence to Privy Council in England, and Privy Council had ultimately upheld the conviction. Right after that, or about that time, when I was first brought into it, or shortly before I was brought into it, there was a fire in Jim Brown's cell, and he was burned. The belief was that they were trying to get him on an ambulance to the hospital. They were going to ambush the ambulance and free him. But he did the job too well. Unfortunately, Jim Brown died in the fire. But his co-defendant, whose name I've frankly forgotten now, was also convicted, and his appeal was overturned. And they immediately, as soon as they got word that the appeal had been lost or by the defendants, they put him on a plane and extradited him to the United States. He went to the Middle District of Florida to stand trial on a drug charge there, and following which he was going to be tried in the Southern District of Florida on 24 counts of murder, to give you an idea of the kind of guy we were dealing with. But as it turned out, he had filed a motion for rehearing, which they did not realize that had happened. He was already been extradited, and then the motion for rehearing appeared, and there was this big political brouhaha about extraditing this guy before his appeal process was completed, and blah de blah. And I was hired to try to get him back to Jamaica, so until the appeal was concluded, at which point he would be extradited. The government of the United States was going to have no part of that. They had him and they wanted him. They weren't going to send him back, and so I had to file suit, and did so unsuccessfully. It was one of the great things about it is the client wanted me to do all I could, but they made it clear they hoped I would lose because they didn't want him. They wanted him instead to stay in the United States. But it was a fun. It was, again, one of my more interesting cases over the years.
And it's and I mean, landmark cases, obviously. But tell me a little bit about the gold plumbing case, because I was looking this up. I had not heard of it before, to be honest with you, but it's really interesting.
Well, the so-called gold plumbing case. My then partner, Bill Freites, and I represented Johnny Jones, who was the commissioner of public schools here in Dade County. He was the head of the Dade County School District, and was a very prominent figure. He had been was on the very short list at the time to be head of the Secretary of Education under Jimmy Carter. So he was a prominent individual and a wonderful man. He was tried in state court on a charge of trying to use public school funds to get some plumbing fixtures for his house in Fort Myers, and the case was obviously extremely renowned here in Miami. It was not a a lot of people had great interest in it, but it wound up being the first trial in the United States. It was tried gavel to gavel and was televised live, gavel to gavel, from beginning to end. So that was the significance there. It was even shown outside of Dade County, in various parts of the United States. Bill Frates, by the way, my partner at the time, was John Ehrlichman's counsel during the Watergate investigation. So he was. It was a fun. We ultimately we lost the case at trial, won on appeal, and the thing ultimately just went away. But he obviously never went beyond that as in office.
That being in office, it seems like.
No, there are people who've remained in office and held office while in prison. So that was in Massachusetts anyway. I only got to ever happen here in Florida.
Interesting. That's real. I mean, that's amazing. What was it like? I mean, being the first like televised gavel to gavel trial, was that a lot more pressure than you're used to, or did you just pretend like the cameras weren't there?
Yeah, you really don't. It did. I didn't notice any effect. I mean, it didn't bother me. The cameras. Florida was televising court proceedings and had been for a few years, so it wasn't anything new, and it didn't really make any difference of who was watching. You never know who's. Figured nobody would be watching anyway. Trials are extremely boring proceedings. They're not. Even criminal trials rarely get very exciting. So I figured anybody who tuned in would probably tune out soon enough. It would never really.
Back in the day before they had 8,000 people doing commentary on it, correct?
Yeah, there was no commentary that I was aware of.
Case, tell us about the first trial about enhanced injury here in Florida.
Oh, that was Evancho v. Ford Motor Company. I was on, my partner at the time was Murray Sams, who was a very prominent personal injury attorney. I didn't do any much personal injury work. I did primarily commercial work, but I did work a lot with Murray when I was a partner in that firm, and it was. The enhanced injury is where a defect in a product, here a Ford automobile, will not necessarily, you're going to get injured in the accident regardless, but the injuries get enhanced and made worse by some defect in the manufacturer or design or manufacturer. The case had actually already been tried once and appealed, and the principle of law had been established in that case in Florida, by the Supreme Court of Florida, and then we were on the retrial. And Ford Motor Company had all these high-speed videos showing that our theory of the enhanced injury. Major Evancho, who was a client, was laying down in the back seat, and when the accident hit his head, the original theory was it struck the seat in front of him. And the videos that they showed that Ford Motor Company came up with indicated that, in fact, that was not the case. He was not hit by his head did not hit the seat at all. his head hit the B pillar, which is that pillar, the structure, part of the structure of the automobile that holds the roof up, located right at the front seat, the rear of the front seat. So we changed our theory that it was a defect in design of the B pillar. It stuck out too far. It was like 6 inches out. They didn't need to have it out that far. And if his head hadn't struck the B pillar, it'd be the head injury is what killed him, not any other injuries from the accident. And so we wound up using the Ford's videos. Was actually, that was the main part of our case. I don't know how Murray planned to prove what happened otherwise, and we had an expert, but we didn't have much in the way of physical evidence. So it really made our case for us. That was a very innovative thing that Ford did for us.
Bad, obviously, outcome, but an interesting case. Wow, some amazing stories. How I just got to find how do you feel changed over? I mean, but where do you think are the big changes that have happened in law, and how do you feel about them since you've been started? I mean, you've seen so much.
The lawyers when I first started practicing were much more professional, in my opinion, than what you see now. I think they had a sense of responsibility beyond just winning a lawsuit, or the so-called, what we would call the Rambo litigator, the people who just think that the scorched earth is the way to try a lawsuit. You see that a lot more now than in the past. I mean, in the past, I think there was much more emphasis on trying to get the facts right and get the case decided by the jury. I mean, you still wanted to win. You did everything you could, but it was not as aggressively pursued as it seems to be these days. And I don't know why that is, other than I guess society's changed a little bit over the last 50, 60 years.
Tom, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for gracing us and telling us these amazing stories over the past 50 years. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Hope you had a good time. I certainly did. Thank you.
And thank you all for taking Tom and I on your journey. This has been Iron Garlic and True Law Stories. All right, so we're going to just